Hi students, welcome back. This week we will be looking at the chapter on global economic structures, and for this discussion we will be using the chapter on structuring the global economy in the text by Ritzer and Dean. So let's start our discussion this week by thinking of a hypothetical example. Let's say one day you wake up and you decide, hey, I have lots of money, so let me take a trip to France and carry all my cash with me. Okay, so you pack like a million euros into a suitcase, and then you board your own your own flight where there are no luggage restrictions, and you decide to fly into that country with that much cash. Would you be able to do it? You will quickly realize, if you start to explore the options, that it's going to be perhaps impossible for you to carry so much cash into France. Okay, so this automatically tells us that there are, we are looking at the flow of a particular type of economic flow, right? That you're carrying this amount of cash into a particular country. That the way in which that flow happens is structured. You will find that there are actually restrictions on carrying so much currency in cash into that particular country, and I think this holds for many countries around the world. Okay, and so therefore, like all good structures, this tells us that what is really shaping the flow, behind that there is a very interesting structure for us to study. Okay, I hope that this gives you a sense of why it is important for us to study global economic structures. So I mean, typically, even in a world where we are supposed to be very mobile and things are supposed to be mobile, there are definitely global economic structures that are at work. Okay, now what we are going to do this week is to look at a variety of different global economic structures. We are going to be looking at structures which are set up where there are multiple national governments that are cooperating. We will be looking at structures that are set up where it's supposed to be a global system. So there are, all the countries, all the national governments of the world are supposed to cooperate. We will also be interestingly looking at some structures which do not involve governments or national governments per se. Okay, so there is going to be a huge variety of structures for us to study. Okay, so before we do that, actually, we do want to take a quick tour through history to understand, the role of structures. Okay, now if we look at economic history, we will see that, although we think that we are living in a very sort of interconnected world, if you look at the contemporary history of the world, you will find that this kind of interconnection, etc., and what spurred economic activity was something that you could see at a global level from very far back in time. In fact, one set of theorists that you have already encountered before, which is the world systems theorists, argued that, I remember I told you, they were one of the first people who started to talk about the existence of a world economic system. And of course, they have argued that there have been multiple world economic systems. Okay, but what they point out is that since the 1500s, there has been a very particular type of world economic system in place, which is the capitalist world economic system. Okay, now the text actually tells you that if you were to compare the kind of system that came up after the Second World War to the kinds of systems that started to come up from the 1890s onwards, you will find a lot of similarities. We take the Second World War as a kind of benchmark because some very important world economic initiatives which structure the world economy came up in the aftermath of the Second World War. Okay, so what were some of these similarities between, let's say, structures that came up in the 1950s and structures that were in existence in the 1890s? Rather, what the text talks about is that, for instance, what were some of the factors which shaped economic activity. Okay, and they argued that, for instance, one thing that shaped economic activity was great developments in both transportation and communication. So, for instance, if let's say a new shipping route opened, or let's say, maybe the railway was expanded, that network was expanded, you would find that it had a great impact on economic activity. Or let's say when a new mode of communication, such as for instance when the telegraph was invented, right, that really had a huge impact on spurring economic activity. They also mentioned that this was like, when you compare these two periods, you will find that the global economy in both periods involved large flows of capital. So, for instance, today we are so stunned when we say, "Oh, look at SoftBank and look at the kind of money it has invested in different markets around the world," okay, or its initiatives. That maybe the volume of money might be different, but certainly relative to the incomes at that particular point in time. Even in the 1890s, we could see that a lot of capital and money was being invested across national borders. Okay. The other thing that the text points out to, for instance, is the role that immigration played in spurring economic activity. Okay, immigration perhaps was also in itself a flow that was motivated by heightened economic activity. But what's always interesting about immigration is that as people migrated to a new place, what they sent back was actually, do you know the term for it? It's called remittances. Okay, so they would send money back to the countries of origin, and those had certain effects in both in the country where they worked as well as in the country where it was sent to. And we will explore some of this, not in this chapter, but in a subsequent chapter as well as a reading. The text also mentions how some ideas about how the world economy should be structured were common in both these periods. Okay, one of these ideas was Ricardo's idea of the law of comparative advantage. Basically, this British economist argued that instead of having a world economic system where all countries produce all kinds of goods, right, or products, we should have a system where a country actually specializes in a particular type of good. So, in other words, he said that your national economy should be focused on producing, a few goods that are actually best produced in your country. So, therefore, you take a basket of goods that is required and kind of distribute it across different countries, and different countries will produce different products based on their natural and comparative advantage. So this is a very sort of early idea about how we can have a world economic system where if you were to be like an average person, you would actually have to use products from different countries in the world already. Okay, it was a very powerful idea, and it has its proponents in both periods. Now, of course, this leads us to the contemporary world economic system. In fact, we are going to be discussing in this segment an event which really propelled or pushed the idea of a world economic system. Okay, and this event was called the Bretton Woods Conference. A little bit of a context on the Bretton Woods Conference. First of all, what was the Bretton Woods Conference? Basically, the Bretton Woods Conference happened in 1944, and it was an attempt to structure the global economy where 44 allied nations came together and agreed to take up a set of economic practices as well as, create some economic structures with the mind that there is a world economy and that different nations in the world need to cooperate with each other for the smooth functioning of this economy. On the slide, actually, you will see so Bretton Woods is actually a place in the United States, and you will see a small, collection of flags, and those were the original 44 allied nations who participated in this conference. So why did these 44 countries come together for making such an agreement? Here we have to understand the historical context a little bit. So, as you may be aware, in 1929 and in the 1930s, the world economy underwent a huge sort of economic shock, which was called the Great Depression. And it was a very significant and traumatic event. So much so that, I think it propelled many changes around the world. Okay, now that was an event that shocked many countries around the world, and they were trying their best to avoid the recurrence of the Great Depression. What also happened in the 1930s was that many countries around the world started to actually adopt the principle of autarky. Now, autarky is an economic principle where you try and ensure that there is a complete self-sufficiency within your own country, okay, which means that everything that is possibly required for the functioning of the country is produced inside that country. How do countries actually do this? One way in which they would do this is by making imports extremely expensive. Okay, how would you do that? So let's say I want to ensure that any chairs that are required are going to be purchased from India only and not from other parts of the world. An easy way to do it is to say there is going to be an increase, a huge increase of taxes on any imported chairs. Okay, so that is what a lot of different countries did, and notable countries in this regard were the economies of Italy and Germany. So as the Second World War came to an end, many countries realized that this kind of an autarky system, where countries are kind of really closed and only thinking about themselves as independent and autonomous entities, may not work. Instead, what may be required is more global cooperation. Okay, they also were very worried that once the war ended, the world could actually slide back into another Great Depression. So therefore, in 1944, these countries came together and agreed on certain terms. Let's take a look at what those terms were. To begin with, they actually agreed, each country agreed to establish a par value for its currency, which means that the country decided that my currency is going to be valued at X units per ounce of gold. Either it was per ounce of gold, or they said it was tied to the US dollar. The text gives you a very good example. It says, for instance, the par value of the US currency, which is the dollar, was tied to $35 for 1 ounce of gold. Okay. At the same time, the country of Nicaragua pegged the value of its currency at 175 Cordobas per ounce of gold. So therefore, it was easy to calculate the exchange rate between the US and the Nicaragua, which is 5 Cordobas for $1. Now, the countries also decided that trade would be conducted with established exchange rates, and that these exchange rates will not fluctuate more than 1% or less than 1%. So let's say the exchange rate is pegged at 5 Cordobas for $1. So this value cannot change either less than 1% or more than 1%. So the attempt was to actually establish very stable exchange rates for trade. It was also as part of the Bretton Woods system that a very famous economic structure came up, which is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. As part of the Bretton Woods conference, the IMF was actually set up. Its goal at that point was to establish and stabilize and oversee exchange rates. Of course, its functioning did change at a later point in time, and we will discuss that later. It is also as part of this conference that the US dollar was established as the global currency instead of gold. Gold used to be the global currency before this change happened. All the countries accepted this, and all these four nations also agreed to remove all restrictions on their currency for purposes of international trade. Now, the Bretton Woods system is quite important because as a result of these agreements, there were many effects that we could see in the world economy. For instance, it had a very tremendous impact on global trade because one of the things that all these countries agreed to was that they would, if there were any trade concessions that would be, offered by a particular country, that would be offered to all countries. Okay, which means that you would not try and stonewall trade with a particular country that you did not like. That was in theory. Whether it happened in practice or not, we would have to see. But that was at least the spirit to which to which these nations agreed. It also had an interesting impact on monetary order. As we have discussed, the aim was to establish stable exchange rates, right? And to a large extent that happened because what happened was that the United States, could not change the value of its currency, and even the other countries could not change the value of their currency every day. As compared to that, you can just take up, I would give you an example. Take up any financial newspaper. There are a variety of financial newspapers that are in circulation today, and just check the value of, of the Indian rupee. If you check it over a period of, a few months or even a year, you will see that the value of the currency fluctuates. This is the case with all all currencies today. Okay, because the system has changed a little bit, but in the Bretton Woods system, countries agree to keep the value of their currencies fairly stable. The third impact was also in terms of global investment. In fact, another major economic structure emerged as a Bretton Woods institution. This was the World Bank, which was, it was established around this period, and the aim was that the World Bank would encourage global investment in a systematic manner. Okay, so this is really, I think, some very far-reaching impact that the Bretton Woods system had. And in the next segment, we are going to be looking at these two structures, which is the World Bank and the IMF, in greater detail.